if anybody has ideas what to name this episode, because genres doesn't really fit, so I'll end up calling it something else.
I thought this is a pretty good episode for the OSR October contribution for Cerebrivore, because that's mostly what we talked about, was defining the OSR and things like that.
Yeah, maybe just
OSR.
What was that, Arlen?
I was trying to come up with a pun, and the best I can do is FOSR.
Oh, yeah, FAUX OSR or FAUX SR.
Yeah,
so it's instead of WTF, it's WOSR.
Maybe. Yeah.
I just realized I keep nodding like you can see me, and of course you can't. Yes, that sounds great.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of playing and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Let on the Cerebrivore, and I'll show them so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. Today we have an interesting discussion for you folks. I've got an esteemed panel here to talk about how can we better categorize role-playing games in genres, so you can look at it and say, oh, that's X genre, I might be interested in that, and it actually be a meaningful thing. So maybe we can establish some common terms that are actually useful, unlike, well, OSR. And why do I say that? Well, let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get into why OSR might not be the most useful term. Today, we have Todd from Hex Press. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, anytime. You're always welcome. We have Kevin from the Redcaps podcast.
Thank you for having me as well.
Oh, not a problem. And we have two of our regulars. We have Arlen from Live from Pelham's Wasteland.
Yep, I'm here as well.
And of course, we have BJ from the Arcane Alienist. How are you doing today, BJ?
I'm just here to sweep the floor when you guys are done sharing your ideas today.
You're too modest.
That's great to be here. Great to be here.
Great. And as always, I'm your moderator, Jason from Nerds RPG Radicast. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Kevin, because although this started on Todd's podcast, Kevin reached out to me, Todd's YouTube show, and there'll be links to everybody's shows in the show notes, folks. But I'm going to hand it over to Kevin so he can tell you how this panel originated.
Great. So I think this month, more so than anything else, because a lot of folks have been doing the October OSR or OS October, whatever you want to call it. The question of what is the OSR has come up a whole bunch in various people's podcasts. And it seems like that started to circle around. And then you had folks talking about, is the OSR dead? Is it too broad of a term? And Todd did an awesome video where he was talking about his views on that. And so it's made me think about it a bunch more. And I've been talking to various folks over the course of this month, and everybody I ask them to define the OSR or what it means to them. And as you would expect, every person you ask, you can get at least one different answer, possibly multiple different answers, depending on how that conversation goes. But I'm really curious at looking at it from the term of genre, not so much of a, hey, let's put guardrails around what the OSR is. But if you were talking about RPGs in general, what is the games that most of us would consider OSR? Where does that fit in a genre? And I think the further you drill down the genre tree, the more argument you get. So I think we can all agree that whether or not you're talking about 5e or OD&D or any other RPG out there, we can probably all say, yep, those are all tabletop RPGs. And everybody would nod and agree. And then you can take a subset of those and say, these are all fantasy RPGs. And again, you probably won't have too much disagreement. And you may even have people that will agree to, this is a classic or old school versus a new or modern RPG. You might lose a few people there, but I think for the most part, you get general consensus at that point. It's once you go one below that, where you go to, is this an OSR or is it an independent game or is it one of these, that the conversations break down and the definitions shift. And that's where I'm really interested in. And I'm not sure if it's because of the number of people in the hobby, where it's a niche market, But if I was to talk to somebody about movies and I said, I saw this fantastic horror movie, and then I gave you a movie that wasn't a horror movie, if I gave you Top Gun, you would all look at me weird, and it would be rightfully so. But you wouldn't hear fans passionately going on about how, no, don't tell me that Top Gun isn't a horror movie. I was scared and it should be. Yes, genre is personal, but I think overall there needs to be a critical mass of people that can define what it is. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm here mostly to bounce off what everybody else has to say, but that's where I'll pitch it in and then let somebody else run with it and tell me how I'm wrong.
Okay, I'm actually going to throw it to Todd, because Todd has already talked about this a little bit on his YouTube channel, and is slightly different, coming at it from a slightly different direction. But
well, thanks. Yeah, totally. I think there's just at least I was feeling a lot of, I don't know about you guys, feeling a lot of just frustration, the idea of doing endless circles around and around about what is the OSR, and nobody can agree with it. And sure, some folks will come out, and I think the thing is, it's interesting maybe about that whole question is some people will look at mechanics, say OSR is mechanically this X, Y, or Z. Other people, it's a feel. Other people, it's a chronology. Other people, could be something completely different. Like I think I got somebody telling me, oh, the OSR is like working on things together and sharing, and making your own worlds. I'm like, but isn't that all role-playing games are OSR? But I'm sure in their mind they have a specific feel for what they like. And I would like to get to something where we can look at more genre, right? And then we can have a mechanical, because I think one of the things I made in my video is like, you say something's 5th edition compatible, everybody knows what that means, because it just means you're using 5th edition mechanics. There's no assumption of anything else about it, right? Or it's D20, or it's powered by the apocalypse kind of thing. And I think that's kind of where OSR started out, and it just got kind of ballooned into, lots of all kinds of amazing stuff, but stuff that took it further and further away. And I guess where I came on the video is, if we're looking at it like a renaissance or revival, at some point that ends. We're not still in the Renaissance, because the Renaissance happened and then we moved on. And I wonder if that Renaissance revival part is, we've revived. It's been revived. The Renaissance has happened. What happens post Renaissance? And I think trying to now break down into things like genres, which I think is great. And I totally agree. Everybody can pretty much, or 99% of the people can agree on a horror movie, but then you start getting into specifics, or, what's a film noir? It has a very specific definition. Then other folks will try to, there's some interesting things in there. And of course, if you drill down into something, even probably something within that genre, a subgenre of that, it would get even more disagreement and more, personal. But it'd be nice to hopefully hear something that maybe hopefully folks will take away from this, is at least starting to at least think about these things in terms of not only identifying maybe what they're playing if they're a creator making a product, but also as you're talking about products, so we can move towards terminology that we can at least all understand. Because right now, if I do a video about OSR, I have to make all kinds of disclaimers and caveats, because the OSR is so broad that I can't just say, if I'm talking about something that's, say, for basic expert, that's my base, that's not going to apply to probably even half the OSR genre, whatever we're going to call the OSR group anymore. So now I have to make all these qualifiers. Well, I'm talking about BX, I'm talking about things this way. And if we could get into a more sensical kind of set of framing, then that'll allow us all to talk about stuff in a way that we can see we're all talking about the same thing and we're not at cross purposes.
Excellent. I'm actually going to BJ next, because Arlen, I think, is going to have an interesting take. And Arlen isn't overly known as an OSR guy, and I'm not trying to pin anybody down, but I know BJ probably plays more OSR stuff than Arlen does. So I'm going to throw it to BJ, and then we're going to throw it to Arlen, and then we'll wrap back around. So go ahead, BJ.
Well, I think you've got, and I think coming out of Daniel Norton or was here with us. He had some pretty interesting comments on this month and in his podcast about kind of waves of the OSR. But I think one thing I've observed that he mentioned as well is that the OSR, which sort of started as sort of a way to try to keep TSR style D&D alive when there was no legal way to access in-print versions of it, has kind of gotten to overlap with sort of the do-it-yourself scene with role-playing games. And so I think a lot of people kind of put together their do-it-yourself. They're simple. Hey, I come up with this really neat, simple system, and my players liked it, so here I'm going to put it up for everybody else to critique and consume. And sometimes because people are working with like BX rules or white box rules, because those are real easy to work with, it overlaps with OSR. But I think there's this convergence of the sort of the do-it-your-scene versus the actual roots of the OSR, and they get kind of, the water gets murky. it's kind of speaking of genre, I was just thinking it's kind of like trying the argument about whether Star Wars is science fiction or fantasy, Well,
It's
which
Western.
games are OSR and which games are do it yourself and which ones are both. It gets real murky at times. And only a Sith thinks in absolutes. So
Well, yeah, and as we go on for our conversation, folks, even when we start talking about genres and what games might fit into different genres, if we get there, we're not going to hit every genre, every subgenre. So if your favorite niche genre or game isn't mentioned, don't feel offended in that. But Mr. Arlen, I'm sure you have something to say on this.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what BJ was talking about and what seems like we've come to a couple of places, which has to do with the publishing history or the availability history of OSR. It seems to me, as someone who was not super into RPGs either, well, I wasn't around for the actual old school, and wasn't even super into RPGs in a lot of the kind of sort of first wave OSR stuff. But looking back, it looks to me like a lot of what kind of spurred the OSR had to do with things like the otherwise lack of access to a lot of the material that the OSR was working with. That a lot of those TSR games, you couldn't just go on DriveThruRPG and buy a scanned copy for, I don't know how much Wizards of the Coast charges, $5 or $10 for a core rulebook. And we're not really in that place anymore. The original stuff is a lot more accessible nowadays with the growth of print on demand and online retailership, especially kind of DriveThruRPG and DM's Guild. And you can get print on demand copies of a bunch of those things if you want them in print. Now, people will, if you spend several $100s on copies from Noble Knight, people will probably have more praise for you on Discord when you show off your collection. But ultimately, if what you want is AD&D first edition in print, you can just go to DriveThruRPG, and I don't know how much it costs, but get the 3 core books and play that game. Perhaps not quite the same way as you might have played when it first came out from TSR, but that the limitation of Wizards of the Coast is only putting out new stuff for like 4th edition or 5th edition D&D, and so if you want to play a game that especially mechanically is much, much closer to the original games, you have to find essentially an indie publisher who has created something with the open games license that, just sort of, and originally my understanding is that legally it was a fairly risky gamble with the open games license as to whether you could use it for something OSR based. That Troll Lord with Castles and Crusades kind of, excuse me, my understanding is that they were one of the earliest, and they sort of put all their eggs into one basket and said, hey, we want to make something that is Castles and Crusades being sort of a blend of a couple of different gaming influences, but it draws a fair bit of influence from a lot of this old school stuff, and they put it under the open games license, not entirely sure whether or not Wizards of the Coast was going to have a problem with the material that was used. And then that sort of paved the way for other people to use some of that material that it turned out was going to be sort of by kind of general agreement acceptable to use within open games license structure as well.
Yep. I think that gives us a great place to start. The idea that, so if we look at the OSR, you've got a couple different groups, and maybe we can start nailing down to what kind of Todd was thinking about here, because you have people that wanted to play the original games. And, for a while, like Arlen said, you couldn't get them. I remember when Paizo put them up, was that 2006, 2007, they had PDFs up for a little bit, and then they pulled them back down because Wizards was worried about the pirating stuff. I got those still somewhere on a computer, 5 computers ago. But so I guess the first group of people, when we talk about OSR, are the people that never stopped playing these games, that are still playing the games. So I don't know what we call them. But the people playing the original games, and then we move on to the retro clones, and then the things that spin off for the field, right? But I guess that first group are the people that never stopped playing the original games.
Yeah, if you go back and look, so I'm going to keep referencing things like movies and music because that's when I think genre, that's the first things that pop in my head. But in many ways, you can look at the OSR almost the same as you would say 70s or 80s music, or where you're putting it in a time period. When you look at the OSR, I was speaking on my podcast. I had Chris Connerman on recently, and tomorrow I've got Matt Finch on. So I'm talking with some of the folks that were around creating at the beginning of this, and they looked at it as retro clones. They were trying to clone the original game. They weren't trying to do an OSR revival or anything like that. That term didn't exist. Their goal was to simply create the games that they couldn't access anymore and have them in an accessible format so people could make adventures and play them, and they could use it to teach people that game. So that was the original goal. I think the OSR itself went through a few phases. You had the original creators that operated largely off of Dragon's Foot forum, and then over time, in just in a couple of years, you shifted to being multiple forums and a lot of people putting out different spins on the OSR house ruling, taking what was a more maybe true to form, like in Osric or in some of the early BX clones, which were very close to being clones, and then starting to add house rules, and you get things like Lamentations and what have you. So you went through a phase where there was forums and some initial games that were simply house rules. Then you went into like the G+ era and blogs, and it was much more. And I think we're now in an era where it's more almost like this will sound bitter or angry, and it's not, but we're in a commercialization period where instead of it being a collaborative thing on G+ or forums and what have you, it's more, you're seeing OSR products primarily showing up on itch or showing up on Kickstarter right off the bat. There isn't a lot. It's now more of the OSR feels like a marketing term, not a definition of what the product is, and which makes it a kind of a terrible marketing term, to be honest, because you can't have a clear conversation. But it includes so much underneath that banner, whereas originally they wanted to use the word term retro clone. That was one of the things Chris Connerman said to me. He's like, we wanted to call them retro clones, but the folks at Dragonfoot was like, that's a terrible name, don't use that. And so they eventually ended up with OSR. But I do feel like when you talk about the OSR in particular, you almost have to talk to it about in phases. It went through this phase, then this phase, almost as if it was like the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s of music type idea. And each one was a little bit different of how it went. I personally prefer to look at it as it was originally. Yeah, it was, BJ just asked, is OSR classic rock? Yes, and classic rock, unfortunately, as you get older, the stuff that was cutting edge alternative stuff is now classic rock. I was a huge Nirvana fan, and now I hear Nirvana on classic rock stations, and it drives me crazy because now I realize I'm old. But yes, I think that does, as time moves forward, if OSR is old school stuff, in 10 years, is 5e going to be considered old school for a group of people who 5e was their initial entry into the hobby? Probably, and they would be completely correct in saying it. So that's why I think if you're going to use it as a term, it needs to be a little bit more firm on what it actually is. And I'm not sure if I was heard, but yeah, BJ, Star Wars is definitely a Western. It's not a not a space spook.
Probably so. Yeah.
Yeah. So Todd, how do we start breaking these into individual categories here then?
That's a good question. I feel like there's probably, if I had my druthers, I imagine if this is going to be a weird example, but if like PG-13 or something will come on the TV or it'll say this, and then it'll have like a little list. Hey, if there was something I was saying, like, here's kind of what it is mechanically, and here's what kind of genre it's trying to do, and then mash it into so let's take Star Wars, right? So we say Star Wars, I don't know, mechanically, let's just say it's I don't even know, whatever we call early TSR mishmash. Come up with a name for that, like whatever BX would be if you looked at it mechanically. It's not quite D20, it's got some D6, it's got a little percentile thrown in there, whatever that is. We'll come up with a name for that. That's what it is mechanically. Great. And then call it a space Western if you want, whatever works, blam. And then we have something that you could put on a book, or you could say to blog, like, hey, I'm working on this, or I'm playing this homebrew game that is a BX based space opera. And then I think like that would give everybody a really good idea, right, of what we're talking about. It's BX based. So if we're talking mechanically, it's that hodgepodge. If we're talking about a space Western, so we know the kind of genre things we're going to be expecting. And then I feel like it would be useful to everybody. Certainly if I'm looking at drive through and they had some kind of organization where I could look for that, that'd be like great. I could tick those 2 boxes in my filter. If I was looking at a bookstore and I could look at the back, oh, this is a BX based space opera, bam, I would have it. So that's kind of what I feel like if I could do it all over again and have a band of 1,000 monkeys go through and label a whole bunch of stuff on itch and drive through and elsewhere. I feel like I would try to come up with something like that. Maybe you call it like TSR 81 or whatever for BX or something would be the designation. And at least once you figure out what that means, you could have even a little blurb that says what it means. Then we'd have like the mechanics and then what kind of game we're trying to create, which I think are we're talking about systems. Those are I imagine kind of the most important things, right, that we want to know off the bat.
I think that's a great suggestion, a great way to do it. So you could, you'd have, WEG D6 if you're going off the Weston Games Star Wars, right? So WEG D6 Zorro, right? For example, for the new Zorro game that came out. So yeah, I don't know. BJ, what are your thoughts on that?
Kevin was.
Oh, I have my hand up right quick.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I didn't. I don't have my glasses on. I'm sorry,
worries.
Kevin.
I was just going to say right quick, not just to point, only because drive-through RPG is kind of the de facto that everybody goes to look at. It's interesting to note that if you go to drive-through RPG, OSR is not listed under genre; it's listed under rule system, which I guess throws out a whole different problem. But it's not even listed as a genre; it's listed as a rule system. But sorry, yes, BJ, go ahead.
I was exactly something you'd said earlier about retro clones, and they said don't use the term retro clone, and now we're in kind of a commercialized era. It's interesting in the last couple of years here, people say, well, I'm running old school essentials, so I guess it's kind of like BX. It's like, no, unless you use the optional ascending AC rule, it is BX. That's like saying, I'm reading the 3rd printing of The Hobbit instead of your 1st printing. So there's probably, it's not the same thing. It's like, no, it's literally just a new.
Well, there actually are some differences between the printings of The Hobbit.
Probably a poor example.
You picked out the exactly worst example.
Yeah. Insert book that doesn't change from printing to printing. But that's, it's like, somebody's like no, I don't want to play OSE. I want to play BX. It's like, well, it's literally the same. There's no difference. Unless you use that one optional rule he's put in there for ascending armor class, which he clearly says in the text that this is an optional rule just because it's very popular. People have been doing it for as long as they've been playing this game. So,
OSE is kind of the interesting bit, right? Because it kind of bucked the trend. Because I think talking about our phases of retro clones and kind of moving away from it, OSE, which feels like it's ancient, but it's really not that old, went back to, nope, we're going to do a retro clone kind of after that phase. If you want to look at the overall scheme of things, I'm going to say it passed. We would have said that it passed before OSE came out, or what did he call it originally? BX Essentials?
BX Essentials, yeah.
But he kind of, he's found an amazingly profitable spot to sit in, but it was interesting because he kind of went back to the retro clone phase after it had sort of already passed over. We'd already passed through it.
And from a marketing standpoint, OSE is almost, in some ways, kind of become the new OSR tag, because you see so many products now that say OSE compatible when, really they're compatible with any BX product. But because again, it kind of goes back to that commercialization thing I was saying, where it feels like people are throwing these labels on because they know it gets eyeballs. So OSR was popular, and a lot of indie publishers were having a hard time having their games seen because we're in a content golden age where there's so much stuff coming out. So it was easy if I slap an OSR label on it, I can get an attention of a certain group, even if it maybe doesn't really fit that. OSE is kind of the same way. Now, at least with OSE, it's going back to what Todd said earlier about it being 5e compatible, where it's based off those mechanics. So when you see an old school essentials compatible label on there, you're talking about a game that's a BX compatible type game. But I think you've got a lot of creators who, because there's so much out there, if you go in and every day there is more content than any person could ever consume, so it's hard to find discoverability. I think these labels get misused because people are trying just to get discovered. They're trying to be seen.
Right. And I think OSC is an important one because we see other retroclone or other rule, OSR rule sets adapting to OSC. So like I don't know if the Kickstarter is closed yet or not, but Eric Bloat from Bloat Games with his Demogorgon, or what was it? Demigods and Demogorgons, or
yeah, it's darkness and dark and Demogorgons or something.
Dark Places and Demogorgons, I think, which is a kids on bike game. But he had his own system, but now he's re-releasing an OSE because he realized that's going to be more visible. And we've gone through phases, right? First was Labyrinth Lord, and then Swords and Wizardry was the golden child for a little while, and then OSE surpassed it. And I love Dan Proctor and Goblinoid Games, and I hope he can make a great comeback, Labyrinth Lord 2. But I'm a little worried for Labyrinth Lord 2 because I don't know how well it's going to do in the current OSE environment. And
yeah, I think in order for I'm going to have a conversation with him next week, and try to talk about that a little bit. But I think he's really going to have to differentiate himself in setting and adventures, or go in a different path with the rule set, which I think would be a mistake. But sorry, Arlen has his hand up.
Yep.
No worries. I just put it up a second ago. But I'm gonna not entirely disagree, I guess, but maybe push back a little bit on that, Kevin, because I think there is definitely a marketing push, and obviously plenty of game designers have figured out that putting yourself in a category that gets searched is a good way to get people to actually view your product on drive-through when nobody's going to sift through, go every day and see the, 120 newest titles since your last visit. Or is there anything in there that I want? That sort of thing, right? It's not going to happen. But I do think there's also, to kind of tie into genre, I think there's a real element of the way in which, we see with genres in a lot of other media, the idea of kind of the way that, especially for lack of a better term, a sort of more widespread cultural familiarity starts to shift the way that a particular genre is received or produced or treated in a lot of ways. I'm thinking about, for instance, in video games, right? That you had, so From Software made a couple of games, and then Dark Souls came out and it was a huge hit. And now there's like a whole category of games that are Soulsborns. But one of the other things that happens is as they keep making, right? From Software has kept making games, many of which have mechanical similarities to the original, but often, one of the things, the most recent one is Elden Ring. And people have talked about how a lot of the bosses in Elden Ring are for people that are totally new to From Software style games are much, much harder than the bosses in the original game. And that seems to be a response to the idea that, well, there's a sort of, broad category of people that are familiar with this kind of concept, this genre of, playing this kind of action RPG where you go through and kill very, very tough bosses. And that allows for something different because the market has changed. And I think there is something to that with the way that the OSR and a lot of the other kind of categories within RPGs have shifted some, that you get, especially as a lot of these ideas kind of filter out into the general consciousness. I think about, I'll use an example that Best Left Buried is a game that doesn't use much that is mechanically very similar to TSR era D&D at all. But if you kind of the sort of author's forward, I guess, I don't remember the exact section, but the author talks about the idea that what he really wanted was something that mechanically didn't resemble TSR era D&D, but got all of the kind of genre elements that he really liked, this kind of grind through the dungeon and this struggle and all that sort of stuff. And that, I guess what I'm getting at is I don't know if that game in particular is listed as OSR or not, so I'm not using it for that example. But I do think there is a way in which kind of the sort of and in some ways I think you might say that it's a difficulty of sort of limitations of categorization, that there isn't a good way to say, drive-through RPG doesn't have like I've heard the term new SR or OSR adjacent or things like that for games that sort of, you might say, wouldn't necessarily likely exist as they do if the OSR hadn't become a big deal, but also do not necessarily have as close a relationship to those original games. And I think there is, as with a lot of genres, right, we can sort of see the way that when, we talk about flipping things over to OSE or to, creating games that are kind of like those earlier games, but are not necessarily retro clones, but still kind of see themselves as part of a similar kind of game design tradition. And I think that there is something going on there. Although I do also agree that there's definitely games that I, will go to a category and be like, this, I don't think actually belongs here, and was just sort of put here because, if you go put something on other unique systems, all you get is, randos who are like, I'll just, buy a game for one shot and never review it or anything like that.
I think that's a great, I'm sorry. Well, real quick, I'll throw it right back to you. I just want to say Best Left Buried is actually a great example of this, the marketing part, because Zachary Cox appeared on the Smart Party podcast back in 2019 when the original edition of this came out. Zachary Cox is Soul Muppet Publishing, who does Best Left Buried. And he was asked, is this an OSR game? He's like, well, not really, but I'll take the title if that's what people want to call it, because he recognized the marketing potential of the term OSR. He accepted it for that reason. But go ahead.
And I think it's I guess what I would say is I think it's exactly it's very much what I was talking about, where it seems to exist in the kind of game design tradition that is related to the OSR, while also having all these other things that it has brought in. And that's kind of an odd space to be, and also a difficult space to market from, to be honest, which is, just one of those things.
Yeah, I was going to say I can't remember if it was because this has happened so much this month, but I can't remember if I sent it over to you, Jason, whenever I was first looking about this conversation. But one of the things that I seen floating around was somebody went to, it might have been a Walmart or a Target or something, and they had seen a box of minis, and these were generic minis of like townsfolk, just like generic little miniatures. And on the box down the corner, it goes 5e compatible. And I think that sums up everything, where, of course, that is what do you mean it's 5e compatible? It's also my kid going and putting villagers around his, toy farm compatible as well. But I think that's a lot of the issues that people are trying to use it for discovery. For what Arlen was mentioning, I think maybe you almost need to have two items. You need to have a mechanical genre and then a feel genre. Maybe there has to be a mechanically, this is how this game is played, and genre-wise, because I don't think you would say from a feel that game would be, it's not TSR related or anything like that. It's a fantasy, it's a gritty fantasy game. That's great. You don't need to go any further. You don't need to go and say this is a OSR gritty fantasy game if it's not mechanically anywhere close to that, right? So I think again, going back to what Drive-Thru RPG does here, they have got OSR underneath the rule system. Maybe rule system should be named as game mechanic. And maybe instead of saying OSR, it says other mechanics, and can list out what some of those are would be. I mean, we're critiquing a website that none of us have any control over, but I think that because of the marketing, because of how people are trying to discover stuff, people will accept that label because it works from a monetary standpoint for them, but then it just muddies the discussion. And then what bothers me the most about it is when a discussion happens and people get hurt about it, when feelings get hurt, and when everybody goes and starts to argue about it, and then you get accusations of, oh, you're trying to gatekeep me out of it. No, I'm just trying to have a definition of what the word is so we can have a meaningful conversation. And if we can't have a common word to base the conversation on, we're just going to talk in circles. So the downside to it, it doesn't do any harm to me if somebody goes and places an OSR label on their product and I don't think it's OSR. But what it does is waste time, and it can create arguments. And it's the arguments that I don't like, because I think especially in the social media space of tabletop role-playing games and the OSR in general, it's such a small niche hobby, and it's so easy for people to have disagreements over silly things. This doesn't need to be a thing. And I don't want any creator to go, hey, I spent a lot of time working on this product and it's an OSR. And if I disagree with that, I don't want them feeling like I'm disliking them. Their product might be great. There's lots of indie games that I think are fantastic that I don't consider OSR, or even old school games like, the Fantasy Trip, I think is great. It's not an OSR game in my opinion, but it's an amazing game. I hate whenever you see that conversation comes up and people use it as a gatekeeping or a hurt feeling situation.
Yeah, I won't call any specifics out, but Kevin and I were actually on a Discord yesterday where an argument broke out over the definition of OSR, which related to someone calling somebody that liked us, or the category of people like a certain game, retards, which is crazy. We're not going to name the Discord or any of that, but the point is, these arguments happen all the time, and it's crazy that you're arguing over what games fall under a certain category. I mean, we're talking about it here, but we're having a civil conversation. But yeah, there's got to be an easier way. So BJ, you understand human psychology better than most.
Maybe a little.
So
Make no claims.
So what do you think? How do you not spoon feed this to people? Although that'd be the easiest thing. But how do you get people to buy into accepting? Maybe not just use the term OSR, but use more specific kind of terms. More meaningful terms to discuss this.
Oh, well, that's a simple question. I'll get back to you and give me a few weeks to think of it. No, I think one of the things we're talking about here that it drives me nuts in any kind of conversation, whether it's online, when people say, well, words don't have a meaning. And it's like, well, if words have no meaning, we wouldn't use words. If words weren't important in your choice of words, and words can have multiple meanings, and I think that's what we're seeing here is it's very imprecise. So I think we all have an idea of what we think OSR is, and there's probably a certain amount of overlap, probably more overlap than not. But then all of us may have one or two little criteria that we come up with on our own that doesn't match the other person's criteria. If you ever look at like an old school cognitive psychology textbook, they'll talk about templates, and they'll show the classic one is a picture of, there's a coffee cup, and then there's a bowl with a ring, like a soup bowl with a handle. And it's like slowly in phases, the coffee cup morphs as you go from left to right into the soup bowl. And it's like, well, what point does it stop being a cup and become a bowl? Where do you draw that line? Kind of most people can agree on the far end we have cups, and on the other far end we have bowls, but where's that transition point? And I think that may happen there. I mean, we've talked in the past about, well, a second edition D&D, what is that? It's TSR D&D, but is it really Gary Gygax style D&D? Well, it's got a lot of Gygax's ideas in there, but it got revised quite a bit. And on paper, you might look at them and go, that's not really that different. But you put them into play and you go, no, this is something different. This really is different. I think the biggest thing we could probably do is just say, when I say old school gaming or when I say OSR, what does that mean to you? And then you say, oh, well, I kind of think about it this way. As long as you can have that friendly, oh, well, I see your perspective and you see mine, and we may walk away without 100% agreement, but we kind of understand where each other's coming from. What's amazing to me is just talking about the discussion, how emotional people get into it. Sometimes it's like their identity is, I'm an old school gamer. It's like, well, then, that means you play these games, not that games, those games. Or that means that, paladins have to be lawful good. And if you can't envision a paladin who's not lawful good, well, then get out of here and take your blasphemy with you,
Right.
Those kinds of, why do we draw, we could be able to show about why people draw those lines in the sand and fight over them. I think normally when I think about clarity of terms in D&D, I think it's mostly important for the table to understand, well, what does an attack roll mean? What does a saving throw mean? And what's the definition of stealth or being hidden or being invisible? Those technical terms for mechanics are really probably the important distinctions we need to know about each other. It's amazing, though, that we get into these other conversations about, it's almost like I don't know, like I said, it becomes like an identity thing, which I guess as soon as it becomes an identity thing and that becomes your identity, you feel challenged, people disagree. It's one thing to say, polite conversation usually avoids what politics, religion, things like that. But people kind of, it's amazing to me to see people put that same sort of emotional investment in their fandoms, which I think this is, you can see similar discussions on Star Wars boards and Star Trek boards and Marvel Comics boards. Just it's just kind of a fandom thing, I think.
I was going to say the identity thing is really interesting, because I think that's why it leads to the discussion being so heated, is because you're starting to, if you say, I am an OSR person, and then not only someone defining it differently than you, but what they're defining it in is stuff that you don't agree with or you don't like or whatever, it's going to hit you like you're telling me who I am and I'm not that other thing, right? Which is going to make it a lot more personal, and going to make you a lot more defensive than if you were trying to think of strictly like, we're just trying to identify this game here. We're just trying to come up with a common working definition. Because I think people do take it like, no, you're talking about me and what I like or how I play or who I am, kind of thing. Which I think is a really good point. I think that comes up way too often. And that's definitely what leads people to really take things into directions online, offline, wherever, that they probably wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, agreed. Arlen?
No, I agree. I think certainly, I think a lot of, or I should say, just about every case of that type of contentious interaction that I have either been a part of or witnessed seems to be related to, moving beyond just kind of the games you play and like, what sort of person are you? What might be your moral character based on your choice of games or things like that. Every once in a while there's something else where somebody just has a shit day and wants to be an asshole online, which happens too, but you know how it goes. I think also and I think this is a classic element, not just of kind of OSR or RPG discussion or anything like that, but really of so much of internet discussion, is that people are really, really bad about like stating their assumptions clearly, and the kind of you don't necessarily have to do like a complete formal logic, look like Gottlieb Leibniz's notebooks, to be able to put together something that's like, hey, here's like the starting positions that I'm taking, and then here's kind of all of the various positions that come out of that, and here's why I think these are clear links between them, right? Here's the syllogism that I'm showing. And I think that's as much as anything, I think it's related to a lot of the structural limitations online. You talk about interacting with people on Twitter, and you don't have nearly enough room to say like, here's 10 tweets of all of my assumptions before I get into my 30 tweet argument, right? That doesn't work really for that type of structure. And even on something like Discord, it's also I think it's a classic thing that especially it depends a lot on who you may be interacting with, I guess. That I think often if somebody is on a Discord that has a particular culture and starts talking about something, that they may make a number of assumptions about everybody's kind of expectations around that thing, right? If you're on a Discord that tends to have a fairly heavy OSR bent, whatever it is that means to people on that particular Discord, and then start talking about the OSR, that can cause people to, describe what they mean fairly differently than if they were in a different space where they felt like they needed to define their terms a little better. And to me, that's one of the core things that gets in here, is that I think sometimes there are really like, what we might say are kind of relatively cooperative people, and unmitigatable differences is perhaps the way to put it. People who are, really, really determined that no, this type of game is not any fun for anybody, and nobody should play it, and anybody who plays it is a moron type thing. But I think that's fairly rare within the hobby. I guess that there probably are some people that feel like that, but I don't think there are that many. I think much more commonly there are people who make a statement and have not clearly stated the assumptions that underlie that statement, or have not been willing to examine their own assumptions. Because I think that's a common thing too, is you see people who, say like, oh, well, this is the best type of RPG. And other people are going, well, but I have fun with this other type of RPG. And they go, well, but if you use my, as Che Webster called it when I talked about it on my own podcast one time, my metric of fun, that this is why this particular RPG, even though you're having fun with it, is not a very good RPG because it's not providing a very high metric of fun. And that obviously, if I said that, I think it would be totally appropriate for people to be like, hey, asshole, you didn't start by defining what, your metric of fun does to, structure the whole thing about, what makes a good RPG, because that's where the disagreement actually lies. It's not in the conclusion, it's in the assumptions, as with a lot of disagreements over a logical process. And what I'm saying, I think a great deal of what we run into with regard to RPG discussion is really in a lot of ways centered around the fact that RPG discussion is so heavily centered on the internet, right? That aside from playing in person with your own group and maybe going to a friendly local gaming store, that nowadays it seems like almost all of what goes on with discussion about games is online and largely in very, very short form commentary structures. Or it's kind of a talking head thing, right? That it's, one person, some asshole named Arlen Walker on his podcast talking for 2 hours about a particular game and doesn't even take any questions at the end.
I think that's
personally
a valid.
There.
Yeah, exactly. No, he can attack himself there, but no, go ahead, Kevin. I think that's a great point, Arlen. Good.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Arlen was saying. I think part of the reason I'm kind of a stickler for the definition of things is in my day job, I do deal with a lot of contracts. And if you've ever had to sit down and look through a contract, about half of every one is just definitions of terms, so that there isn't any of these arguments. It's this means this, so we're all on the same page of what this means. And there isn't somebody trying to twist it later. And you don't get that. Although what I find interesting is that there are certain things that people will generally agree on, right? Like we can agree that most of the games that we're talking about here probably fall underneath a fantasy RPG. Like, I don't think there's a ton of people that are going to confuse a fantasy RPG and a space-based RPG or a sci-fi RPG. I think those distinctions can be made easily and there's no discussion. It's only when you get down further into the minutia. And as far as the argument side, yeah, if you look at like folks that are passionate about Star Wars and Star Trek and they bicker back and forth. I remember that being the big thing when I was growing up, are you Star Wars or are you Star Trek? And I think both fandoms, while they might argue it and make fun of each other, I think both fandoms recognize that, they're both big, well-known franchises and what have you. It's more about my team thing win, right? Like I'm a huge hockey fan. I'll make fun of baseball all day long. I think baseball's a silly sport. Sorry, baseball fans, but it's a silly sport. And I'll argue up all the good sides of hockey. It's not that I don't think baseball's a sport, and I even recognize that it's incredibly popular, that it's a good thing, but I'll still make fun of it and promote up hockey over top of it. Not because I'm anti-baseball. It's more just, go my team type idea. And I think that happens a lot as well in the space of, people get riled up about something because they're trying to defend the thing that they like, and they think that if you say it's not this other thing, then you're slighting it in some way. And I guess that goes back to what Tom was saying about identity. It becomes an identity thing, which maybe that's the moral, is don't wrap your identity into a thing like a product or a label, and then that way you can avoid getting feelings hurt whenever somebody doesn't see it the same way you do. But.
So what's if anybody has a comment on that, well, Arlen does. So go ahead.
I think the discussion about, talking about Star Trek and Star Wars and, other kind of major franchises is kind of an interesting comparison, especially when you talk about not just like are you a fan of Star Wars versus Star Trek and which is better? And would the Empire beat the Federation in a fight or something like that? But especially when you get into talking about like the behavior of fans, I'm going to use the Star Wars example in particular, but it also, I think, does apply to Star Trek, because both of them had, recent movie series that plenty of fans liked. And I think there was also plenty of pretty aggressive online backlash. And it gets into a really I think, interesting point, especially once you take the kind of or get to the point or realize that, plenty of times kind of fan reaction to the treatment of their particular identified group or quality or whatever can be really visceral and inappropriate, certainly. But also the intense fan reaction is what makes those franchises valuable to the companies that pay lots and lots of money for them, which is kind of a complicated thing, right? That, if none of the fans gave a shit about Star Wars, Disney wouldn't have bought it for so much goddamn money, right? That's important, I think, to recognize also that there really is a monetary value to the powers that be to have passionate, dedicated fans, in addition to all of the other stuff. And I see that sometimes, to go back to RPG space, people will, for instance, talk about, criticize 5e, and, people who are big fans of 5e will say, well, I have lots of fun playing 5e. And it's like, well, okay. So, I mean, that's fine. But also, yeah, you really feel the need to go up to bat for Wizards of the Coast, I see, right? It's just an important point there, right? That I think, a lot of that kind of, really intense brand identification is not just something that happens in a vacuum. It's a little bit like when I think it was a thing that my mom told me about, how soda companies basically think that a consumer has been picked by about the age of 3 years old, right? That by the time a child is basically old enough to recognize the logo of a particular brand of soda, they've decided, are they a Pepsi fan or a Coke fan, basically. And that, the point being, in the same way, right, that, the Star Wars people and WotC and all of the various people who are stand to gain monetarily from really intense identification with these various franchises or trademarks or whatever thing it is, that they do stand to gain for all of that, rather than it being just something that is totally kind of an arbitrary individual decision.
Yeah. BJ.
Well, in response to what Arlen just said, at this point, when you have you go to a theme park or an airport or someplace where it's exclusive, and we only sell Coke or Pepsi, you're basically just holding half the people there hostage. Yeah. They're not like, oh, wow, I was a big Coke fan, but I had to spend a layover at the Atlanta, not the Atlanta airport, they do Coke, but I drink Pepsi, but I had a 2-hour layover at Atlanta, and now I'm a Coke person. No, you endure that for 2 hours, and then first thing you look for when you get somewhere else is your brand. That's a tangent. I think the danger of making it too much of your identity is kind of the stuff we're talking about, particularly when the proprietor of that IP, whether you're talking about Disney, Wizards of the Coast, Warner Brothers, whoever it is, then tries to expand the market to bring other people. They want to recruit new fans, and I don't want to get us into a tangent about gatekeeping and stuff, but I think that's where a lot of that comes from, is you see people who you don't see yourself in them, and you're like, well, how are you here? Because you're not like me. And that's totally irrational, and it's pre-conscious, and it's not, people are not consciously thinking that, but it then sometimes comes out when these emotions come up over these other topics, where they realize.
I think it sometimes gets into part of what I was talking about earlier with the way that widespread consciousness of the original becomes a defining factor of the later stuff, right? If you talk about, especially with Star Wars: The Force Awakens, it's a movie that is really built upon the fact that everybody who's going to go see it has probably seen A New Hope a bunch of times and knows exactly what happens in that movie and all that sort of stuff, because you can't make a Star Wars movie where nobody has seen a Star Wars movie anymore. And it's a difficult thing to do, but it also gets into, what happens when, you try to riff on it and the riffing doesn't quite work as well, or the riffing seems inappropriate, or, even it's a classic. It's a little bit like you see, for instance, in horror post Lovecraft, that there are, there's some Lovecraftian authors that are like, oh, hell yeah, deep ones are really cool. And then there's other Lovecraftian authors that are like, oh, hell yeah, the feeling of, existential horror that comes from recognizing that when I smell, nasty shit, that means that it's getting into like my sinuses because that's where it is. That's what's really cool. And those are sort of two different elements of Lovecraftian horror. And there are people who are like, oh, hell yeah, deep ones are Lovecraft and smelling weird shit, that's not Lovecraft. Versus other people who are like, what, deep ones? No, deep ones are just like a weird thing that Lovecraft came up with because that's a specific example of what I'm getting at, I think, has to do with the way that once something kind of transformational is on the scene, that it really makes it sometimes very, very difficult to recapture precisely what the original transformational thing was, even if you could do it again.
To pull it back to RPGs a little bit, I like one thing that you said there, Arlen, that I think was really poignant, is that people can't see a new Star Wars movie without having the memories of the past Star Wars movies. They've seen them before, so there's a level of expectation. I think that's probably very true with RPGs. So it's difficult to play an RPG without somebody having had some idea of what it was before, to the point where when you look at some newer indie RPGs and some of the criticisms that get thrown out at, say, for example, Old School Essentials, where people say, well, it doesn't have all the teaching material that's inside Basic BX. I think a lot of it is because there's a lot of game makers that just assume people have had some exposure before, and so they're counting on that cultural assumption of, what an RPG is, what dice are. We're not going to waste our page space on this. But I think that plays into it as well, is that people have an understanding of what they think an RPG is, and it's that understanding is going to be different for each person depending on when they first came into it. It's kind of like a baby bird. It imprints itself on the first thing it sees. Well, I think a person's going to imprint RPGs based off the first contact they had with them, and that's going to set the bar for everything else that they do. And I think that maybe is a part of the problem there as well. So yeah, just to kind of pull it back to RPGs, I think, how do you start defining things whenever everybody's first contact is different? So everybody's cultural understanding of it may be a little bit different depending on where you came in. Somebody whose first RPG was Vampire the Masquerade versus somebody whose first RPG was original D&D, way, way different. So I don't know. Todd, you've been quiet. What do you think?
I've just been listening. I mean, I feel like that's why my personal thing was that if I had my druthers just remove OSR as an actual label, right, and go for the more specific things. Simply that way, we don't have to worry about all these discussions. And if you want to use OSR as an additional label, I suppose go ahead. Then it becomes just kind of indie, or if you want to. I mean, I don't know how indie it is. Some of these guys are going to be big enough that they're like number 3 behind Paizo and WotC. So how indie is indie, but maybe whatever kind of label kind of fits that can be that kind of pull on the heartstrings, but that when we want to actually get into the nitty gritty, we have some better things or some more, I think, concrete terms to use, right? Because I think that we can get out of if we just say, hey, we're talking about something that's, like I said before, TSR 1981 sci fantasy. We can get out of all the value judgments about whether it's like that's just it. That's mechanically, here's what it is, and here's the genre. And then sure, there might be some little arguments about the genre, but I feel like we can kind of narrow that down and then be done with the discussions. We can just get on to more interesting stuff. Whereas, like I said before, we start just saying OSR, and for some people it's going to mean Troika. For other people, that's going to mean Basic Expert or White Box. And those are fairly different. They're different enough that I can't talk about something that really, and be sure that I can encompass both of those, that whole range of systems. There's even other stuff beyond that, right? So that's kind of where I just feel like for the kind of stuff that I do, I'm not going to stop using OSR like when I do YouTube descriptions and things, because it's still this term that people search for, and I need to play with the algorithm or suffer the consequences of trying to go against it. But I think one of the questions before was kind of what can we do? And I think that's just to start using it. And I think I'm going to do that when I start talking about things. I can't drop the label OSR for the moment, but I'm definitely going to start incorporating, trying to be more specific about what something is. And I think that will help a lot of folks get a handle on things, or at least make it easier for me to talk about it and know that I'm talking about something, and that whoever's listening or watching me will know that we're kind of talking about the same thing.
I think that's great. Maybe that's something we could all slowly work towards, is if, we can't make anybody do anything. And I don't necessarily want to live in a world where somebody could make somebody do something. But at the same time, if we kind of get on the bandwagon where we're trying to, when we review games and talk about games on our individual shows, if we do this kind of naming convention or definition convention, hey, I'm going to talk about this game today. I'm going to talk about Troika today. It's an advanced fighting fantasy rule set in a weird sci-fi world or science fantasy world, right? If we start using this kind of convention, maybe it'll slowly spread to other people and be a little more useful. Because like somebody said, Kevin, I think said, we have no control over Drive Through RPG, but we can maybe slowly make an influence through the Anchorsphere and YouTube creators and things like that. And if enough people start using this kind of definitional system when they review games, it will slowly spread. If we can get that, that snowball rolling, right? So, well, I don't know. What do you guys think, Arlen? Go ahead, Arlen.
Sorry, I was trying to tap unmute and kept accidentally just hiding the unmute button. I will put forward another opportunity or potential, which is that we could just learn to perform necromancy and summon the ghost of Samuel Johnson to write the dictionary of RPG terms, and then just have one dictionary that everybody can use for all their RPG terms.
I like that idea, and I would get behind that, but I don't know that I'm not a high enough level to do that, sadly.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a little difficult on that one.
Yeah, but I don't know. What do you think, Kevin? I know you have to leave soon. I want to make sure you have a chance to promote anything or point attention to anything that you want to. Is that something realistic, you think, for you to do in the future, to when you talk about rule system, new games or different games, to give this kind of definition with them?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of time, but yeah, I think for me, with the way I would probably approach it, is trying to define both the mechanic separate from the feel of the game. So it's this kind of mechanic set in this kind of world. Because I've said many times too that Gary Gygax didn't play D&D. Gary Gygax played Greyhawk. Dave Arneson didn't play D&D. He played Blackmore. Their game, they referred to their games by the world that they played in, because that was the genre and the house rules and everything else that they did. So I think maybe it's important to also do that. Say, I'm playing a game that is this mechanic, but the genre is this, so that you can kind of, if people didn't know what Greyhawk was, they could be like, well, what's Greyhawk? Then you could explain the genre. I think there's a way to combine the both of them. The only problem is that it comes down to, how do you fit that on the cover of a book, or how do you fit that in a tweet? And that's where the problem comes in. That's why, the 3-letter acronym of OSR is so powerful. And I think that's why the 3-letter acronym of OSE has become popular. And 5E it's because it's small. It could fit on the cover of a book, and it's got a logo and all those things that, saying even D20 had a logo, was small, could fit on a book. It's difficult to do that in a more verbose manner, the way that we're speaking of, that a person could actively use, or that Todd could drop in his YouTube channel to have the algorithm be fed. It's difficult to put all that in there in a meaningful way. I think that's partly where this problem of it being used for commercialization side comes from. It's because there isn't that short, catchy way to do things.
Yeah, I'm going to throw it to BJ here, but right before I do that, I will mention so I know we have there's some folks out there like Rob C over Down the Heap, it comes to mind, and Daniel Norton of Bandits Keep, that hate's a strong word, that dislike roll under the attribute mechanic for skill checks, right? But if we're looking at, say, ICRPG, and we're looking at Black Hack, and we're looking at pick your flavor, Dungeons and Dragons, are all D20 games, so there. When we come up with this mechanical, is we slowly work on a more distinct mechanical thing, maybe you put roll under attribute in there. I don't know, but there needs to be a way to kind of differentiate between those things, because that, like, roll under attribute's a dividing line for some people, which I don't, not necessarily for me, but I know some people it is. So you have to look at things like that. But I don't know, BJ.
Well, I think that's a challenge because you have to talk about, is that a core mechanic or is that a ancillary thing? So if you're playing, kind of classic types of D&D, the roll under mechanic really just applies to those cases where nothing else works and you go for an ability check.
And it's in the game.
If you're playing the black hack, that's the core mechanic. So is it a deal breaker if it's anywhere in the game, or is it a deal breaker if that's kind of the primary task resolution system?
Well, it's in BX anyway, so it's not. Sorry, I apologize for cutting over you. It's actually in BX, which is funny that's those guys' favorite game system, but they just like that mechanic.
Yeah, but it's only there if you got to make an ability check.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Saving throws it's still a D20, but attacks and saving throws use different their own thing. So, yeah, I think that's it. And then it gets, at what point there's another dimension we talk about, and is this a rules light or a rules heavy game? How crunchy is it? Sometimes the number of different subsystems we use to address different facets of the game is what contributes to that crunch. To me, I think 3rd edition D&D is sometimes held up as the crunchiest of the crunchy, because it's got a rule for everything, but it's really only got a couple of mechanics that drive those rules, versus like AD&D, where saving throws work this way, and combat works this way, and ability checks work this way, and thief skills work this way, and that gets pretty crunchy in a different way. So yeah, I think one of the things we want to use if we're creating a taxonomy of how to refer to games is unified mechanic versus multiple mechanics, subsystems, or however you might refer to it. And I think some people they have their preferences. It may depend on, this week I want to play a complex game, and next week I want to play a simple game. Some people are like, they don't want the extra cognitive burden of having to learn 5 different rule sets to play one game. And some people just love it. They love it if there's a different die and a different, thing to do for every facet of the game. So probably the most important thing is that everybody at the table who's going to play together has a common understanding of what we're doing. Like you said, don't tell me we're playing D&D, we're playing Greyhawk. What is Greyhawk versus what is Blackmore versus what is, and I think that I've been thinking about an upcoming episode for my show, talking a little more about this. Is D&D has become its own thing. And sometimes the D&D-isms get in the way of world building and trying something different, because, you can't have that in D&D. It's not D&D anymore. Well, what are those things? Is it alignment? Is it the classes? Is it the races? Is it the mechanics? Is it the names for spells? What is it? But but yet D&D tries to do that. Greyhawk tries to be different from Forgotten Realms, which tries to be different from Ravenloft, which is different from Spelljammer, and it tries to cover a broad range of tropes and subgenres within heroic fantasy. But you always wind up having to put in a little bit of homebrew here and there to create those new and interesting worlds that people have never seen before. But how far can you move away before somebody says, well, I thought we were playing D&D. This isn't D&D. Why not?
Yeah, it's tough because, like you say, without having a 100 character or 2 paragraph description on the rules, how do you differentiate between the D20 systems? So I'm going to throw this back to Todd for a minute. Or no, go ahead, Arlen.
I'll hop in for a second.
We'll make it easy on Todd.
To the sort of Borgesian nonsense extreme and say that, well, the description of the nature of the game is the rule book of the game, and so if you want to find out what it's like, go read it, or just have a description that's even longer than the rule book, right? Be like, here's the core book for 300 pages, here's 500 pages explaining the exact nature of this game.
Yeah.
The nature of the game is the game.
Yep.
I mean, I think at that first you just have to stop somewhere, right? I mean, at some point you get in there and say, hey, it's D20. You could try to do something. Maybe there's a mechanical version of like D20 modern versus D20 whatever, where you could put a little asterisk or something like D20U is unified. D20, maybe you could have like a little pictograms of the different dice you use. If pretty much everything is D20, you just have a D20. If it's D20, D6, D100, you could do that. But I think there's always going to be a little nuance that's lost, right? There's always going to be some edge case. I just want to get something that, at least from a little distance, you can kind of get closer. And then, yeah, to the point of, if you want to get into those fine-grained differences, well, this is when you discuss the book or the whatever it is, and then you can talk about it, and then you can read it or whatever and decide if it has something you dislike or like. I think the goal isn't necessarily to define every facet in some kind of logo, but just to get the broad brush stuff set aside so that we can get into those details. And instead of worrying about the kind of OSRness, we can talk about how it uses attribute roles or how it does this thing or whatever that might differentiate this D20 system from another D20 system. Because at least when we're all talking about that stuff, isn't that really what we want to talk about, is what makes these things unique and different and how they're great additions or comparisons with each other.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think there's, even in the classic sense, look at what games I think everybody would agree are OSR or even BX games. Like if you just want to say BX games, look at how many different ones you might have very strong splits on whether it's ascending or descending armor class or how the saving throws are done. I mean, I don't think anybody needs to have that as a item that goes on a box. Those, like you were just saying, could be discussed when you're discussing that specific game. But having an idea that, yeah, this is a game that's at its core was based off of BX, and they've tweaked a couple of things here. You don't need to know every tweak. That's whenever you're talking about that specific game. But when you're talking about a category of games, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we go. I think it was it Arlen that first mentioned the Souls-based games. Maybe we almost have to start making genres where you're basing it off of another game that everybody knows. Like all these games are BX-based games. All these games are AD&D first edition games based off of that. Like, I mean, that's kind of the reason that Osric was created, right? It was, they wanted to have a product that everybody could then make AD&D products for without using that name. And yeah, maybe it's a matter of the only way that you can get people to agree is by linking it back to a previous one. I mean, if you look at Black Hack, how many, insert blank line hack games are there that are all basically just Black Hack, slightly rethemed or slightly house ruled, with the exception being White Hack. But I mean, like you've got a whole genre that got based off of that one game name. Maybe that's the way to go with it. I don't know.
Yeah. You could have Power by the Apocalypse is the same way, right? You have the whole genre of games that are based around that basic mechanic from Apocalypse World, and then they just, it spiraled out, which is great, because if you say it's a Power by Apocalypse game, we all know what you're talking about when you say that. Or if you say it's Call of Cthulhu based or BRP based, D percentile based, we all know what you're talking about there. So yeah, I don't know. That may be the way to go. I think actually we probably hit to what we can do today for the most part. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go around, give everybody a chance to give final thoughts. And if people want to comment on final thoughts, they definitely can. And then we'll let people promote anything they want to promote. I am going to go to Kevin first because I want to be precious this time. I don't want him to have to pop off before, in the middle of somebody else talking. So Kevin, you go first, and we'll go around, like say final thoughts, and people can, comment on final thoughts and anything you want to promote today.
All right. My final thought is the whole discussion around this for me has mostly been about wanting people to be able to communicate without there being arguments around it. So I think if anything, the five of us have sat here and we probably all have very different views on very different things, and we have different backgrounds and there's different age groups here, but this conversation happened without anybody choking each other. So try to emulate that on the internet. It is a game. We're all here to have fun. The genre, I think terminology is important, but it's more important that when people are having that discussion, that it's done in goodwill. So try to do that, I guess, is my recommendation to everybody. As far as what to promote, I have the Red Caps podcast. This month we're doing the OSR October. We're trying to show kind of the best parts of the OSR or the people from that community that I think are positive. So you'll see a lot of interviews on there this month from me. Greg Gillespie and Chris Gonerman were on there. Tomorrow there'll be an interview from the Save for Half / Save or Die podcast team are coming on, and Matt Finch will be on, Dan Proctor, a bunch of other folks. Check it out. It'll be fun. And then the last thing to promote out is I'm doing a charity drive for Extra Life. It supports the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. If you're interested at all, go over to www.theredcaps.net and check it out. Thank you.
Excellent. Arlen, you want to go?
Not really, but I will.
Well, we can pass it on if you want.
It's okay. I apparently brain blue screen in the last like 10 minutes or so. I'm coming off of a flu shot yesterday that I thought I was all the way day before, brain blue screen. But I thought I was all the way done with it, and I am apparently not as coherent as I thought, as I just tried to type the same thing into 3 different tabs on my computer. So it was great. It was fun to talk with you guys. I had fun doing this. I do sort of the Live from Pelham's Wasteland stuff. It's kind of on hiatus. But it's like the Emperor in 40K, where if you sacrifice enough psychers to it, it might come back. And also I do Cerebrivore sometimes, which is what you presumably are listening to right now. So you should listen to that more, because I'm on here sometimes too. And I think that's everything.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll go to Todd.
Well, I'm just I guess happy for coming on. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm glad that I'm glad that my video led to some interesting discussion and not just, no, you're wrong, why are you bothering us, go away kind of responses. Actually, I guess I'm just so small on YouTube that the comments, even the bad ones, are fairly okay. Nothing super cringy there. But I'm just glad that it's spawned some interesting discussion. You can just find me all kinds of places, but I guess YouTube is where I'll point you to, youtube.com/C/Hexpress, all one word. I stream just about every weekday, including earlier today, when I'm starting to put together a framework for doing hex crawly stuff in 5th edition. Because even though I'm kind of OSR-ish, my stuff is mostly about OSR games, I have a lot of viewers and listeners who are running and playing in 5e games. So looking to kind of help them out. It's just been interesting looking at the hex crawl mechanics from the kind of 5e perspective, as opposed to the kind of BX-centric perspective that is my norm. But that's me. Thanks.
Excellent. And folks, there's more than that on there too. Todd has videos where he talks about like adapting mechanics from Barbarians of Lemuria. He talks about Rysis on there. Todd does a wide variety of things.
Absolutely. I'm not OSR only. I appreciate that, because it's like everything else. It's easy to get boxed in. But I look at all kinds of different RPGs. I'm pretty much open for everything. And I recently crossed over the 600 video mark on YouTube. So I don't know how I managed to do it, but if you go search on there, I'm sure you'll find something to intrigue or at least waste a couple hours on.
Excellent. BJ.
A little podcast called The Arcane Alienist, and it's kind of sporadic. I try to get something out every week, but some weeks I get a little too busy. So anybody that wants to give it a listen that isn't already listened, it's available through Anchor. I noticed my calls have dropped off lately. So I don't know if that's a function of the Anchor apocalypse or what, but love to hear from anybody either about Cerebrivore or about the Arcane Alienist or anything else. So.
Okay, excellent. There will be links to everything in the show notes. The only thing normally I don't plug anything. The only thing I am going to plug, I'm going to plug Kevin's contest, and there'll be a link in there because it's an important fundraiser, the fund drive for important cause. The other thing I will mention my podcast, Nerds RPG Variety Cast, mainly because right now we have a sponsor for a contest. The GMologist Presents podcast is sponsoring a sci-fi horror contest. Call in, say what kind of sci-fi horror, what your favorite sci-fi horror thing is. And the GMologist Presents is going to send anywhere in the world some Traveler modules, and then I'll get with you and donate some money to charity. So it's a really good cause. That ends on October 28th of 2022. So you have to get your entries in before midnight your time, whatever that is, on October 28th, 2022. But if you hear this before that, then please feel free to enter. The worst thing that happens, even if you don't want these Traveler things, it's a copy of High Passage, 1, 3, 4, and 5 from Classic Traveler and the Great Rift Adventure. #1 Islands in the Rift from Mongoose. So anyway, it's free stuff. You could, if you didn't want it, you could sell it back to Noble Knight or something, and I'll give money to a charity of yours. So that's always a good thing. Okay, folks, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next week. Take care.
See you later.
A Nerd Central broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the Simon Hemstrom. The all stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's playing teeth, or suicide in your brain. Baby, what I mean is this exchange of fake and from what I understand, that's what don't look now, the Super Bowl is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, you can hide, I'll think above in any order. Just another brain or we go toss us running for the border. Just a snack like a one master. Here and here, very expected buzz. You can eat on a billy, and his customers never say it. It's savoring the flavor of the movies it created.
Okay. Quick question. I don't know. Normally we're an explicit podcast, so normally we don't worry about swear word. But if you guys are promoting, I should have mentioned that to Todd and Kevin ahead of time. I apologize if Arlen offended you guys. But probably not. But if
Did
you
I
guys
say something? I don't even remember.
All those
at this
dirty
point.
words you said, man. That was
You-
terrible.
Oh.
Terrible.
well,
Just kidding.
you didn't say
I
anything
thought-
too horrible.
I thought
dropped
you were
a
gonna
couple, but-
be mad because I told you it shouldn't be the Anchorpocalypse. It should be the Anchormageddon.
Oh, no. We're good. That part didn't come through. You must have been muted when you said that, I think.
No, because I told you before when it was the first Anchorpocalypse,
Oh,
and I said
gotcha.
it shouldn't be the Anchorpocalypse. It should be the Anchormageddon because apocalypse just means reveal.
Yep. No, that's right. Now I remember that. You're right.
Yeah.
No, the only really dirty thing that he said was whenever he started talking about the new Star Wars movies. I was kidding.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I was going to
Pretty
offer to go
nasty
through.
stuff.
Yeah. Normally I don't bleep anything out, but if you guys are going to promote this somewhere where you want a clean show to promote, I could bleep out the shits and things if you want me to.
Were they ready? I didn't even remember.
Yeah, they were-
It's fine.
he-
I think it was interesting that you talked about
Couple things, but
Star
yeah,
Wars.
okay.
As random thought I had was, I think for Gen X, we saw the prequels and we're like, what the hell, man? But if you were like 9 years old when the
Yeah.
Phantom Menace came out, you love them. And now there's this sort of Gen X millennial thing. And I think my son's generation is going to be the same thing when they hear millennials griping about, and Gen X griping about the sequels. They're going to be like, I was 10 when my dad took me to see that at the theater. What are you talking about? That was a great movie.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
for me, I'm definitely in the Gen X group, but I mean, even I'll say that the race scenes in episode 4 there were amazing. Or sorry, episode 1, were amazing. Pod racing was amazing, right? Like who didn't enjoy that? Who didn't go, oh, that's amazing? Because nobody's like the Jar Jar Binks. That's what ruined it.
Star Wars
This is
ended.
pod race.
Star Wars ended in the mid '80s with Ewok movies on TV. That was the last Star Wars.
That's when it jumped the shark.
Yeah, that's when it jumped. But no, I accept those in my canon. But actually, as far as the new Star Trek go, the first and third movie are fun popcorn movies. I can do without the Connery.
I just can't take the
retcon, but-
stupidity.
Yeah, well, that's why I call them popcorn movies, right?
Ooh.
I mean, when they can't even come up with a good, Star Trek was always coming up with some kind of pseudo-scientific words for stuff. When you can't do better than red matter,
Yeah.
then it's like you're not trying. Like you're not even,
I will-
Crimsonian, something.
Abrams is the P.T. Barnum of screenwriters. He'll excite you and thrill you enough to keep you distracted. And then on the drive home, when you're replaying what happened in your head, you're like, that didn't make any sense.
Yeah, that was funny because my friends and I, we experienced that exact thing when we went to see Independence Day in the theaters. Like in the movie, it's
Yeah.
like, all right, but then on the drive home, we're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all.
I will say for Star Trek stuff, that I just blanked on the name of the show. The new one where they were with Commander Pike or Captain Pike.
Strange New Worlds.
Strange New Worlds. That is, of all the Star Trek properties that have come out in the last X number of years, fantastic. It's so well done. They really knocked it out of the park. And I think, again, pulling back my generation of Star Trek fans into it, more so than some of the other newer shows. But yeah, go check that one out if you haven't seen it. It's awesome.